Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Lots of things happening in the world around us, so thank you for taking time to prioritize students. I have the honor of kicking off today's events, and I'm going to try to do several things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we did at Georgia State, but the overall message I want to get across is an approach to student success that has increasingly been shown to be effective from an evidence-based perspective. I'll give evidence for not only its effectiveness at Georgia State, but at a growing number of institutions that are partnering with my new institute, this National Institute for Student Success. And part of what I'll do, for those of you who don't know much about that institute, is talk a little bit about its work and some of the results we're seeing in our first couple years of existence. This institute is a nonprofit embedded within Georgia State University. We have a staff of over 40 full-time individuals who do nothing but help other campuses implement evidence-based approaches to student success. But let me start back about 12, 14 years to my home campus of Georgia State University. I think a lot of you know that we're a big urban university. Our main campus is right there in downtown Atlanta. This fall we have about 53,000 students enrolled overall. You may not know that in 2016-17 we were consolidated by the state of Georgia with the largest community college system in the state. So we now oversee 5 community college campuses in Metro Atlanta. The reality is Georgia State, until recent years, was not well known, was not distinguished in any particular way. We're not the University of Georgia, by the way, the big football school. We're not Georgia Tech, very elite public institution. Our greatest claim to fame historically is probably our geography. We have the very uncommon distinction of having our main campus in downtown Atlanta bisected by a National Park Service historic district. So I sit every morning working about 4 or 5 blocks away from that brick building at the bottom of the screen there. That's Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Reverend King and his father before him were head pastors. Reverend King's childhood home is right there a couple blocks away. The grave site, for those of you who have visited the district, is right there. So we're living and working every day at Georgia State in this geography that is infused with historical significance. But for much of our history, we did not live up to this legacy. I pulled these photos from the Georgia State Photo Archive. This is what Georgia State looked like when the Reverend King was doing his Nobel Peace Prize winning civil rights work. We were whites only, segregated into the 1960s. So think of the sad irony of that this world leader in civil rights is preaching just a couple blocks away from an institution that's the embodiment of everything that he's fighting against. Much more recently, though, than the 1960s, Georgia State was still grossly underperforming, especially for our students of color. So these are our IPED 6-year bachelor's graduation rates as of about 20 years ago, 30% overall. Gaping equity gaps based on students' income level and on race and ethnicity. So we were a poster child for equity gaps to the point where, and I hope this isn't true at your institution any longer, we had gotten to accept them as just inevitable, right? Every year we'd run the numbers. Every year our black, our Hispanic, our low-income students would graduate at lower rates, and we shrugged our shoulders saying that's just the way it is and the way it has to be. And what makes Georgia State's story get some attention nationally is, while we started in this rather low position, we had a number of demographic forces working against us. So over the last 15, 20 years, we have been at the cutting edge of demographic changes going on in Georgia. And I don't have to cite what, Election Day today for you to know that the face of Georgia has changed dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. Here you see it kind of in a microcosm about what's happening at Georgia State. When I arrived as a junior faculty member right out of my PhD program in the late 1980s, Georgia State was still majority white. In fact, it not only was majority white student body, it was over 75% white. And this is how rapidly, the demographics in at least Metro Atlanta have changed. We became a minority-serving institution about 15 years ago, and every year since we just get more and more diverse, to the point now where over 80% of Georgia State undergraduates self-identify as coming from minoritized backgrounds. And we don't have any majority population at Georgia State any longer. Our largest single group are actually our black students now, about 40% of the student population. Well, as we all know, these kind of demographic shifts don't typically correlate to improved graduation rates, nor does this demographic shift. The other change we went through at Georgia State is our students have gotten a lot less well-resourced financially. The last recession hit Atlanta really hard. There was one point during the last recession where among all metro areas across the U.S., Atlanta simultaneously had the highest unemployment rate and the highest default rate on home mortgages. Well, we all know when economic downturns like that occur, the impacts do not distribute equally across the population. The families that send their sons and daughters to Georgia Tech, to University of Georgia, to Emory University, which is about 4 or 5 miles from Georgia State, we know from the demographic detail most of these families are middle, but especially upper middle and upper income. And while those families lost wealth during the last recession, they were not predominantly the families losing their homes and losing their jobs. Those are the families that send their sons and daughters to Georgia State. Mostly first gen, mostly low income, a lot of recent immigrants to the U.S. and so forth. And what happened at the beginning of the last recession, as you see on this chart, is within a 5-year period, we doubled the number of Pell students we enroll at Georgia State. We went from under a third of our students qualifying for Pell Grants to now almost 60%. To put this in some kind of numerical perspective, this fall semester at Georgia State, we're currently enrolling 29,000 Pell students across our various campuses. The entire Ivy League this fall is enrolling about 9,800 Pell students. So we're trying to educate 3 times the number of low-income students as the entire Ivy League. It's not going to be business as usual. It's also not the opportunity to do something we love to do in higher education, which is if you've got a problem, throw a program at it. Let's create a special program for our first-gen students, for our Pell students, for our African-American males and so forth. I'm not criticizing that in all contexts. It may well work in your particular situation. But I will say that it didn't seem a feasible path forward at Georgia State in 2011, 2012, when I was in charge of our programs. Because you can create a program for Pell students if you have 300, maybe even create a program if you have 3,000 Pell students. You don't create a program when you have 29,000 Pell students, right? You just change the way the institution operates at its core for all students. And if there's one kind of overarching message you take away from today's discussion about the approach we used at Georgia State, and I will say it's also the approach we're promoting at the National Institute for Student Success, or what I'll refer to as the NISS currently, it's just that when we found something that worked, we didn't make it a program for a subgroup. We made it the way we do things at Georgia State for all of our students. And we didn't begin to see significant movements in not only improved graduation rates, but reduced equity gaps until we made that strategic change. Now, obviously, I'm going to talk this morning about some of those approaches and their impacts. But before I do, let me set the stage a little bit further, because it's not just the demographic shifts that were kind of providing us with headwinds as we were trying to improve student outcomes at Georgia State. We were facing some other challenges. We were going through a period where we as an institution had decided to broaden our admissions criteria. So this was not a story of being more selective, quite the inverse. About 12, 13 years ago, the state of Georgia came to us with a problem. University of Georgia and Georgia Tech, the 2 other large comprehensive universities at the public level, had both made a decision to climb the U.S. News and World Report rankings and become more and more selective and more elite. And what that meant is there were a lot of students in the state of Georgia, and Georgia was growing in population at the time, who didn't have a comprehensive public research institution that was going to accept them. And these were in many cases, students who in the past could have gotten into, Georgia Tech or the University of Georgia. So they asked us to broaden our admissions criteria and grow in size, and that's just what we did. We began a policy of admitting basically any student who met the minimum criteria for admission to a 4-year comprehensive institution at Georgia State. And what that meant, and this was not a surprise to us is that our incoming SAT scores began to go down, not by a little bit, but as you can see, by quite a bit. And most institutions wouldn't stand in front of a group of 300 people and brag about their declining SAT scores. But I think it's important for us to realize that we do not have to, and in many cases we don't have the luxury of manipulating the circumstances and the students who come to us, but have to adjust and serve the students who we admit. And that's just the story of Georgia State. And for some who think that we might be doing this in a time of great new resources, that also is not the case. That the state of Georgia has been aggressively disinvesting in higher education over the last decade, and our state appropriations over this time period have declined by about $70 million. So under these circumstances, it's really easy to lose hope. It's really easy to point fingers, right? We'll begin to improve our woeful graduation rates when K through 12 gets its act together in Georgia and starts producing students who are better prepared for college work, better math skills, better reading skills and writing skills and so forth. Or we'll begin to improve our graduation rates when the legislature stops cutting our budget by $8 or $6 or $10 or $12 million year after year after year. It's easy to do those things, but the people in this room can't fall prey to that easy pathway, right? We're the frontline people who are going to hold the line and try to look and prioritize the importance of students. So what Georgia State did at this time was something very different. About 12, 13 years ago, we began quite consciously a public conversation that began with the simple question, are we the problem? Now, we all know in this room, if you have students coming to your institution who are better prepared academically or have better financial resources, they are more likely to graduate. That's irrefutable. We also know if you had more money and more resources to hire more advisors and bring in more supports and scholarships and so forth, your success rates would go up. But those two issues are not on the table in Georgia right now. We don't have the ability to snap our fingers and admit better prepared students or get the legislature to change in what are now decades-old policies of disinvesting in higher education. I suspect those issues are not on the table at many of your institutions either. We know from my work at the NISS, we're working with the public institutions in Kansas and Michigan and Maine and so forth. These states are facing huge demographic shifts in a challenging negative way. College-age students going down in numbers. The idea that their path forward to improving outcomes would be, oh, let's be more selective, is laughable. And sadly, it's almost equally laughable in some of those states like my own that we're going to get the legislature to change its mind and say, you know, we've really made a mistake over the last decade. Let's make you whole as far as all these budget cuts are concerned. What we can do, though, is recognize that there are ways in which we are also complicit in the fact that students leave our institutions, right? So we began at Georgia State looking at those things that are within our control. We got much better with the data in ways that I'm going to talk about, but we used the data to put a mirror to ourselves and ask the simple question, how are we contributing to the attrition of our students? Not to be self-punishing, but to be practical, right? I don't have control over the legislature. I don't have control over K through 12. I have a lot of control over how we admit students, how we register them for classes, how we onboard them to majors, how we advise them, how we package them for financial aid, how we prepare them for careers or even communicate with them on a day-to-day basis. Why don't we begin looking at those issues? Because if we find a way in which we are flawed in any of those categories, there's a path forward. We can also look at, could we resolve that particular weakness or problem? And that's just what we did. We used those same data teams that helped us diagnose the specific ways in which we were failing our students to then help us pilot alternate approaches. And when we found something that worked, as I mentioned a moment ago, we scaled it across the whole student body. Now, there are literally a dozen different ways that we've done this at scale at Georgia State. And I know immediately after this session, I'm going to be in this room to have a more casual conversation and answer questions and so forth. What I have time to do with you as a group this morning is talk about 4 examples. And in each case, I'm going to start with an embarrassing data point that typifies how poorly we were performing as an institution. And I urge you to embrace that kind of dialogue on your campus. It's painful at first, but it can be very liberating to actually publicly admit the things you're doing poorly. And most importantly, it is the beginning of a path of resolving those issues. If we continue to brush them under the rug, then they don't get resolved. So here's the first of the 4 I'll share with you. It was shameful. As recently as 7, 8 years ago, 19% was Georgia State's summer melt rate. So we were losing almost a fifth of our incoming first-year class to summer melt. I think this room knows, but I'll just underline, summer melt is not the same as yield. Yield is the percent of students you admit who ultimately come to your institution. Summer melt is much more insidious. Summer melt is the percent of students you admit who raise their hand and say, yes, I want to attend your institution. They put down a deposit, they come to orientation, they sign up for classes, the beginning of classes begin, they're nowhere to be found. Almost 1/5 of our students we were losing to summer melt. So we took seriously our commitment to let's diagnose what's going on via the data. So here's one of the data sets we came up with. We tracked all the students we admitted to Georgia State for fall of 2015 who said that they were coming, confirmed, signed up for classes, but never showed up once the fall semester began. We said, okay, what happened to these students? What did they look like? You're looking at the profile now. There were almost 300 students in that one semester alone who were confirmed to enroll but never attended a single day of classes. Look at the demographic breakdown. You know, when we're talking about equity gaps, this is how destructive they are. Before the first day of college classes, we're already disproportionately weeding out students from underserved backgrounds. So obviously, as you can see in the data, this group was very predominantly a low income and made up of students of color. So the next thing we did with the data team is say, okay, these are the 300 or 278 students who didn't make it to the first day of class. What did they have in common? What links them together? Did they all wake up some morning in early August and say, you know, I graduated from high school, I took the ACT or SAT, I applied to college, I got into college, I confirmed my intent to enroll, I came to orientation, I signed up for classes, but I've now decided I don't think I'm going to college after all. As we all know, that's not predominantly what happens with these students. What we found linked the 278 students together is that they failed to navigate some administrative, bureaucratic process that Georgia State had put in front of them. We counted about 14 things that a first-time college student needs to do to be ready for the first day of classes. You know about the FAFSA. You know, we began to really delve into data of, you know, all these students who get the FAFSA completed, we take a sigh of relief, but then we had about 1/3 of our students who completed the FAFSA being selected for verification, so that they had to provide some additional documents. So often we didn't even know it was happening. In July, some first-gen student is getting some notice from the Department of Education saying, oh, we see you list your grandmother as your legal guardian on your FAFSA and claim your parents are not providing any financial resources for your education. Please provide the legal documents that show your grandmother is your legal guardian. Well, we know how it works in low-income families. You know, they're not going to lawyers and transferring guardianship. Mom and dad are gone. Grandma takes over. The student gets these kind of messages and knows that there's not any way of responding in the way that they're being requested. And they're a fatality, right? They're one of the students who gets weeded out of the college-going population. And this was being repeated over and over again throughout the summer. We found a big problem, for instance, with immunizations. We've run these data now 7 or 8 years. I don't know, in 7 or 8 years of running these data, we've had a single student from a middle or upper income background that's been barred from enrollment for Georgia State for not having immunization records. It's always low-income students. So what we began to see in the data is not that these were problem areas where we hadn't really appreciated how devastating they could be in the past, but they all disproportionately impacted students from underserved backgrounds. So we were creating equity issues, blaming K through 12, which admittedly was part of the issue, but blaming entirely K through 12 for, in many cases, instances that we ourselves were creating. So what did we do? We made two simple changes for the cycle in 2016. None was extremely costly, and both, as you'll see, were highly scalable. The first thing we did is create a portal. The portal walks students through the 14 steps they need to take. As they log on, there's color coding that shows which steps they've completed, turns colors, there are resources and so forth on the page. It's nice to have the portal. I'll say the biggest advantage of the portal was to give us data that we never had before. We used to know these students were engaged, and then we stopped hearing from them. And that literally was the conversation in admissions. Yep, here are 200 students who came to orientation, but we just haven't heard from them since. Now we know exactly what was the last thing, the last point of contact, the last process completed by each student. This student got all the way through these steps until we asked for their immunization records. And then we can reach out now with much more specific help and support. In fact, collecting these data over a couple years allowed me to go to our CFO at Georgia State and make a proposal, which he was very receptive to. I said, we're losing all these students who are not able to provide us with immunization records. And then the state of Georgia will not let them advance to the point of enrolling. And we tell them what they need to do at orientation, but they don't resolve this on their own. And, we can all in this room understand why. You tell a student from a first-gen low-income background with poor health care access, don't come back to campus in a couple weeks till you get immunized for measles. And you might as well tell them don't come back till you come up with $10,000 because they don't have the context and resources to resolve that issue on their own. So what we propose doing is we would contract with a mobile health clinic. It would park outside of every orientation, and it would be available to provide free immunizations to any student on the spot, so that we're resolving the issue for the students rather than expecting them to figure out a way to figure this out. And Georgia State to this day offers free immunizations to all students throughout the whole year. So we began to work through some of these issues through the portal, but the other change we made that got more attention nationally is we became one of the first schools to, and yes, I'm going to be the first one to mention this in a talk at this conference, we began to use AI. This is back in 2016 at scale to communicate via text with our students. So what we did, this was long before generative AI, we built up a knowledge base of over 2,000 answers to commonly asked questions by incoming students. In fact, for those of you thinking through this process, we looked at our emails and logs of questions from previous years to admissions and financial aid and so forth, and then began to build up this knowledge base based upon what common questions had come in previous cycles. And then we work with a vendor. We're working with Mainstay. We were their first partner nationally, by the way, to put these answers in an easily accessible way for students. So our chatbot is not an app. Students don't have to log on to anything special. They just go onto their texting platform and begin a conversation with Pounce. You're looking at Pounce right there. Our panther is the mascot of Georgia State. And from that point forward, whenever they have a question, they just go to their phone as if they're texting a friend, but they text Pounce and can get the question answered 24/7. As I say, this is not generative AI, so the AI is not writing the answers to the questions. AI is instead using algorithms to understand the text question that comes in and go in the knowledge base and pull out the right answer, or, importantly, if there's not a right answer reliably identified, then the AI delivers the question to a staff person who writes the answer, vets it, and so Pounce is constantly getting smarter. The AI tool initially had 2,000 answers in it. Now it has over 4,000 answers in it. So we launched this new tool in May of 2016, just for our first-year students, thinking maybe we'll have 5,000 or 6,000 questions answered before the start of fall classes. In the 3 to 4 months before classes began, we had over 180,000 exchanges with our students. When a question came in, Average response time was about 6 seconds. But what was really revealing in the data is that the use of the chatbot was, from that first day, and it's true to today, heavier at 12 midnight than 9 in the morning. Right? It's not just that we began to serve students 24/7. What the data showed is we began to serve students who weren't getting help in the past. So if you're working, as 80% of our undergraduates do and have a job, you're not available typically to come in and get help or even to make a phone call at 9 in the morning. You're getting home from work, you finished your shift, you're beginning to deal with the FAFSA or verification or all these other issues, at 11 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock at night. If you have children, if you have responsibilities for helping to care for parents or grandparents or siblings, again, you're not available during 9 to 5 hours in many cases. So what this tool began to do is not just provide resources to students, but provide resources to students who in the past had difficulty accessing them. And did it make a difference? Well, 2 changes here that we did scale within a year across the whole student body. Did it make a difference? We've reduced summer melt at Georgia State by 50%. It was 19%. The most recent fall, it was 9%. The students have not gotten any more savvy about navigating bureaucracy. We've gotten better about scaling and understanding the kind of supports that students need. And because it's worked so well for our incoming students, we now have the same tool available to every enrolled student at Georgia State from the time they matriculate to the time they graduate. We've run randomized control trials. We've now completed 5 randomized control trials. And we've seen in every instance, not just improvements in 2 to 3 or 5% in students' performance on specific acts that they need to complete to advance their studies and their enrollment, but in many cases, as you can see from this chart, 15, 20, 30, 40% better improvement in completing the FAFSA, beginning the term without a balance, coming to see advisors, participating in particular programs, and so forth. And because it's worked so well for our incoming students and to help students with enrollment issues, we've begun to use it academically. So this tool is in the pockets, in the hands of every student. We have over 40,000 Georgia State undergraduates who are using this tool every semester. So we began to reach out to some of the instructors responsible for teaching the largest enrollment classes at Georgia State. Our single largest enrolled course is American Government. We offer 8,000 seats a year of American Government. It's required by our legislature to offer this to public university students. And so we work with the head instructor to say, look, would you be interested in us working with you for a semester? Before we launched the tool, we spent a whole semester with this instructor and TAs and adjuncts and so forth in the course, looking at the patterns of the course, what questions were coming up, when were assignments, what were the critical moments, and so forth. And the next semester we launched with the chatbot being able to answer students' questions 24/7, at least the most basic questions about the course, being able to nudge the students. We have an assignment coming up next week. Do know this is going to take the average student about 2 hours to prepare for it. Have you, carved out the time to prepare for this assignment? There's a quiz me function where before a quiz or exam, a student could say, I've studied some, but I want to see if I'm prepared. Can you ask me some questions that I can, kind of test myself and see my preparation level and so forth? We thought in, kind of how we were launching this, we'd be happy to see any results through the randomized control trial that were measurable improvements. We didn't see marginal measurable improvements. The average grades for students on this bot improved by 7 points in their final grade on a 100-point scale. And first-gen students, the leap was even bigger. We've done research. If some of you want to check out these articles, you'll see the researchers, they're independent evaluators led by Lindsay Page at Brown University, are seeing that this tool is not only helping students with the content material from the course, but it's also helping them figure out how to do college. I mentioned this earlier, that Atlanta Public Schools play a big role at Georgia State. It's the biggest feeder district to the university. And quite frankly, by most measures, it's not the highest performing public university system. So a lot of these kids are coming to us with not really clear expectations about what it means to produce work that has deadlines and that, if you don't do it, you're going to get a 0 and there's not an easy makeup and so forth. And so what Lindsay Page and her colleagues have seen is that it's helping students not only understand American government, but understand some of the expectations of college. We've since tried it in other courses in microeconomics. We've now piloted an intro to chemistry. And we also now have a large project funded by the Department of Education's Post-Secondary Student Success Program to work with our colleagues at Morgan State, represented in the room, and colleagues at UCF, represented in the room. Over the next 4 years, we're going to be scaling this tool, this AI-enhanced tool, kind of a coach in first-year math and English courses across Georgia State, Morgan State, and UCF. The second of the examples I want to give you this morning starts with another sobering data point. We were surprised when we tracked these data. We wanted to understand why it was taking so long for Georgia State students to finish their bachelor's program, and we came across this data point, that the average student graduating with a bachelor's degree from Georgia State about 10 years ago was going through over 2.5 majors before they graduated. Again, when we looked at the data, we came to the admission that we were the problem, right? Georgia State, our brochure, webpage, brags about 80-something different bachelor's degrees, 150 minors, certificate programs. Every term at Georgia State, we offer over 3,000 sections of undergraduate courses. In our infinite wisdom, our orientation for our mostly first-gen, low-income student body used to look a lot like this room. In fact, very similar in size, 200 to 300 people at a time, all in the room, somebody standing in front with a microphone telling people, pick some courses, pick a major. And they would go on to their iPads and so forth and make some selections. They were compliant. We got everybody registered most days, but we also got the results we could have expected, which is they were registering blindly, right? They were making decisions that ultimately had very weighty consequences without any context to know what was the right pathway forward. And so we've changed the way we onboard all first-year students to either Georgia State or also all of our two-year campuses. They all start the first semester in learning communities, groups of 25 students. We found just from that structure alone, and it is the norm, you have to default out of this structure if you don't want to participate. It's the norm for all our first-year students. They're in groups of 25 students taking their first semester classes together. At the community college, we're happy if we can get 3 to 4 courses for the learning community, so it's not necessarily the full schedule. But what we found is just from this structure alone, the students are doing the heavy lifting. They're building up study partnerships, friendships, exams coming up. They're working together because they see the same faces in each class. We cannot afford to cap our classes at 25. Maybe the English composition class is at 25. All the other courses are larger, but there'll still be familiar faces in the room, right? You're in your economics class or your government class, and you'll see familiar faces. Just that structure alone, which really costs us nothing. We have one partial staff person who helps part-time to develop these block schedules for us and so forth. We saw a significant improvement in retention rates and in GPA. But to deal with the problem of students moving between majors, we organize all these learning communities around meta majors. So we put no pressure on first-year students to decide what they're going to major in among the 80 choices. If they know, fine, we'll put them down for that major. We'll still put them in the meta major related to that area. So what we do is try to find an area of interest for each of our incoming students. Do you want to go into the arts, into STEM, into business, and so forth? If so, we find 25 other students who are sharing that interest, put them in a learning community together, and then we can, as a result of the way they're registered, push programming at the students thematically in a much more strategic fashion. So the students who are in business learning communities, and we have 17 or 20 of them every fall, they get particular programming, they get invited to open houses in the business departments, learn the difference between accounting and finance and risk management and so forth. We have alumni panels, so we'll have business majors come back to that group, talk about what they're doing and so forth. Give the students a fighting chance to make a more informed choice as they're picking majors, rather than doing what so often happens. Oh, I want to be an accountant, and you take 2 or 3 semesters worth of prerequisites, get into your first accounting course, and decide that's not for you after all. We're also layering data into this learning community structure in interesting ways. So we're working with a company called Stepping Blocks. They're a data scraping company that looks at career outcomes. We have trouble with our alumni surveys getting many of our alums to respond about what they're doing currently. What Stepping Blocks does is look at websites like LinkedIn, but 100 other professional websites, and find individuals who've listed themselves as graduating from Georgia State. Often that'll include when they graduated, in what major, and so forth. And so we've set up websites that look at, like the one you're looking at. This one is for political science for every major at Georgia State. It shows for Georgia State alumni in political science. What organizations are they working for? What kind of titles do they have? What are their estimated salaries and so forth? And we hardwire that into the meta-major process. So when a student is talking about, oh, I'm thinking of going into accounting, or maybe I want to go into sociology, we'll pull up these screens and actually have the student explore the data of these career outcomes. We got our faculty involved in a light touch way that I think has been very effective. About 6 years ago, we started a seed grant program. If a faculty member at Georgia State is teaching an introductory course in any discipline, they can get a small grant to help them design one graded assignment in the course that gets the faculty to think about the NACE competencies, the learning outcomes that the student is picking up in the course. So this is an example from American government on the screen, where the American government faculty, it's American history faculty got together and created an assignment for their Intro to American History class, where students are given a primary data set of historical data, but then they're taught data visualization tools, and one of their graded assignments is to take the visualization tools and show the significance of the data via these visualization tools. So we now have over 100 courses at Georgia State at the introductory level. Every time they're offered, the students are compelled by the faculty member to think about, oh, here's something I'm learning in this class that I might be able to apply and use after I graduate. So what's the impact of doing these kind of structure changing? Again, not expensive changes. We're not talking about hiring a bunch of new people. We're talking about doing our registration process in a more intentional fashion. We've dropped the number of students changing majors after the first year at Georgia State by about a third. That's a wonky data point that I wouldn't brag about in front of a group of legislators, but this room will understand. If you can get a third more of your students in the right fit major in the first couple semesters, that's going to have really positive impacts, and I'm going to talk about some of those impacts in just a minute. The third of the examples of how underperforming Georgia State was is this one. That about 10 years ago, we were losing 1,000 students every semester for financial non-payment. These were success stories academically. These were students who were eligible to take classes and had chosen to do so. They were registered for their classes. But they were either getting barred from registration because they had balances, or in many cases getting dropped from their classes because they didn't meet the payment requirements at the payment deadline. 1,000 students every semester. So we tried to understand this phenomena better, and we just completed a major longitudinal study. We looked at 75,000 bachelor students over an 8-year period between, the years were 2013 and 2021. We asked one simple question, but the results, I think, are going to apply to your campus as well. We asked, what was the ultimate graduation rate for the students who never got barred for enrollment for financial reasons versus those who did get barred for enrollment for even a single semester? And the results were even more sobering than we had feared. The graduation rates for the students who are barred even for a single semester for financial reasons from registration or enrollment are 50 percentage points lower. 50 percentage points lower than the students who don't have that financial obstacle that they face during their time at Georgia State. You know, most of these students, because we talk with them, think they're coming back, right? I'm going to stop out for a semester or two. I'll earn more money. I'll save it up. It'll help me cover tuition and fees, and I'll come back and finish my degree. And most of them do not. And that tells you something about what your strategy should be with these students. Don't let them stop out for even a single semester for financial reasons. So some of the headlines of what we learned in our data is, of the students who get barred from enrollment or stop out, only about a quarter ever come back and complete their degree at Georgia State. More encouragingly, a lot of the students who are being barred from enrollment didn't owe us $10,000 or $8,000. They owed us a few $100s. So that began to get us thinking. And maybe the most surprising thing we saw in our data, especially when we began to become a majority low-income student body, what we found is the students who are most likely to stop out for financial reasons were our seniors. Students who were the closest to graduating. And we all can play out why that would be. We didn't anticipate it till we saw it in the data, but then it was, oh, I get it. Because these are the students running eligibility for their aid. 80% of our students are working. A lot of them do not finish in exactly 4 years. Georgia has a state scholarship, the Hope Scholarship. The Hope Scholarship only covers 4 years. So you had all these really good candidates for completing their degrees who are getting right to the precipice of completing and graduating and rocking across the stage and so forth and stopping out. And then only 24% of them coming back to complete their degree. So this was the inspiration for a program that we launched in 2011 and 12, which we label Panther Retention Grants. It's a microgrant last dollar program, entirely data-based. So I put in red, no application required. One of my greatest frustrations after spending the last 15 years in student success is that we so often ask students to jump through hoops to provide us with information we already have. So think about it in this instance. We know which students we're barring from enrollment for financial reasons. We're the ones doing it. We also know which students are seniors. We know which students are making good academic progress. They're not withdrawing from all their classes. They're getting decent grades and good risk for actually graduating and so forth. And we know which students have run out of eligibility for their aid programs because we're the ones that calculate that eligibility and tell them that they've run out of eligibility for their aid programs. So why the heck would we ask students to come to some office or go to some website to apply for one of these grants? We just began doing the calculation, saying, here's a senior close to graduating, only needs 6 credit hours to graduate, making good progress, but run out of eligibility. Let's put the money in their accounts. And we began doing that. The first semester, 40 students. We've now given over 20,000 of these grants over the last decade plus. And what we've done with these grants, which average under $1,000 each, is basically prevent thousands of students who would have stopped out for financial reasons from stopping out at all, because now they're made whole and they're able to continue to enroll. And once we did that, layer it upon the same type of data set we were just looking at, what that ends up doing is pulling their graduation rates right back up to the level that the rates would have been if they hadn't faced these financial problems at all, because they're not stopping out because of this grant. We are now, for senior recipients of this grant, graduating not 24% of the students, but over 80% of the students. And we just completed a randomized control trial and longitudinal study with Ithaca SNR, and they found not only were students graduating at better rates because of this microgrant, but they were graduating with far less debt. It's much more efficient from a financial perspective for a student who needs 6 credit hours to complete those 6 credit hours today than to stop out and come back and take 3 one semester and stop out again and take another and so forth. And this is going to have a profound impact on the outcomes we'll get to in just a second. But first, I'm going to share the fourth and final of the data points that characterized some of the problems we were facing at Georgia State. In some ways, this was the biggest challenge for us, probably the biggest challenge for you as well, which is the phenomenon of stop-outs, students who are academically and financially eligible to return, but who simply do not do so. So these are not the students we were just looking at. They were registered for classes, and we were barring them because they couldn't pay us. This is the larger group of students who, yeah, they got passing grades last semester. Yeah, there's no hold on their account, but they don't come back. We were losing almost 6,000 students every year. And if you asked me, and some of my bosses did, the president and so forth, what's happening to all these students, we couldn't provide an answer. We didn't know why they weren't coming back. We all know how notoriously difficult it is to get in contact with these students or have them respond to phone calls and emails and so forth. So this prompted us to begin our work in predictive analytics. This is before EAB, before these platforms and so forth existed. We began to engage in a data project to understand what were the activities that students were performing prior to leaving us that might help us predict what was going to happen 6 or 12 or 18 months down the road. So we used a big data set. We used over 10 years of our data, 40,000, more than that, 2.5 million grades, 140,000 student records. The idea in the data set was just to see what kind of identifiable academic behaviors correlated in a statistically significant way to students who would eventually drop out or stop out of Georgia State. We thought we'd find a few dozen. We found 800. And so with the help of VAB, we've been tracking those 800 risk factors for every student every night for the last 12 plus years. We do it across all our community colleges now as well. You know the pattern that at the time this was novel, it's not any longer, that when a student triggers one of these alerts, the next morning one of our advisors gets that notice, and they've got basically 48 hours to reach out to the students with some kind of protocol. We've now had something like 700,000 to 800,000 interventions with students over the last 12 years based on predictive analytics. So what I can share with you is the insight that most of what the fancy analytics system at Georgia State tracks is just common sense behaviors we always knew put students at grave risk. So one of the most common things that we're tracking and intervening to prevent is students registering for the wrong classes. 3,000 times every semester, students will sign up for courses that don't apply to their degree program or not in the right sequence and so forth. And in the past, 3,000 of those students, in all likelihood, maybe we'd catch a couple, would have taken the wrong course. They likely would not have performed well in the class. It would have pulled down their GPA, created SAP problems and so forth. Now we are catching those issues before the start of the semester and getting students into the appropriate courses to advance. Course attendance. It's never been a mystery in retention that students need to be engaged in attending their classes to have a good chance of succeeding. At Georgia State, with 3,000 course sections every semester, we didn't have the beginning of a way to collect attendance. I was in the room, 12, 13, 14 years ago of some discussions about, with the Senate, should we be requiring it? It just never got even a step forward. Now we're looking at the electronic footprint of students, looking at things like logons to the LMS. One thing we did get our faculty to agree, and I am a faculty member, so I'm talking in the first person as well, the faculty agreed that they would post the syllabi for the course on the LMS. They would have other sorts of ways in which the student would get essential course information from the LMS. So now we're looking as early as the first week of the semester. If a student signed up for classes and not logging on to the LMS, we're reaching out to that student. We're not truant officers to punish. We're going to see, can we help? Do you have all the resources you need? Has something happened that changed your mind about enrolling the semester? Are you facing other difficulties and so forth? The analytics, the predictive analytics at the core of the whole process are also highly intuitive, right? We've found a strong correlation, I'm sure it's true at your campus as well, between the first grade a student gets in their major and the chances of them graduating on time. So if a political science major gets an A or B in their first political science course, they're graduating at a 75% clip on time. They get a C in their first course, they're graduating at a 25% clip on time. We always knew that that was a warning sign, but we never quantified the data and then systematically tracked and acted upon it. And now we're doing that. If a student gets a C in their first political science class in our political science major, we're reaching out. We'll have somebody sit down, look at their papers, exams. Are there issues they need support in writing and reading? Are they in the right major? Are they working too many hours? Let's diagnose the problem before 75% of these C students go on and drop out of the university. The trick is to do this at scale. The trick is to do all these things at scale. And over the last 12 months, we've had about 100,000 interventions with Georgia State students using alerts coming out of this platform. That may sound overwhelming, but remember, we've got 53,000 students at Georgia State. So what it means on average is 1.5 times a year or thereabouts a student's getting this kind of proactive outreach to say there's something you did that we can help rectify or help put you on the right path again. As soon as we launched this new approach back in 2012, we saw a significant improvement in semester-to-semester progression rates. We've also seen some surprising data. Most of our faculty were supportive of this move. There was a minority of faculty who thought that if we use predictive analytics to advise students on a day-to-day basis, all the students will end up in the easiest courses and the easiest majors. So If you have that discussion at your home campus, Georgia State's a good test case because we've had, as I mentioned, about 700,000 interventions. Haven't found that to be true at all. Since we launched 12 years ago, our fastest growing majors are STEM majors. We've had overall about 100% increase in STEM majors, but the biggest increases have been for subgroups, demographic groups that were struggling disproportionately in STEM fields in the past. So we're up 100% overall in STEM degrees awarded, but 160% for black students, 220% specifically for black males, even more than that, over 400% for Hispanic. In all cases, the increases in STEM degrees awarded to these groups far outdistance the increases in enrollments for these groups over the same time period. And when we looked at the data, what we found is we didn't see 200, 400% increases in students declaring STEM majors. What we saw is big decreases in students declaring STEM majors and then wiping out after a semester or two. So we were passively sitting by in the past while, an African-American male says, I'm a biochem major, and we did nothing when they struggled in calculus, did nothing when they took their first chemistry course and struggled. And 2 semesters later, they were definitely out of chemistry or biochemistry and maybe, in all likelihood, out of the university entirely. Now we're reaching out as early as the first week of the semester to offer support, and we find many, many more students navigating those courses. So what has been the impact of moving to predictive analytics? Well, we just completed a 6-year RCT using Ithaca S&R to estimate the impact on our students of this predictive analytics-based approach to advising, and their estimate is that it's improved graduation rates by about 7 points. For black students, who, by the way, are not demographically identified in any of the predictive analytics, they're getting the same interventions as any other group. All groups are getting the same academic-based interventions. The improvement in graduation rates, a full 15 points. But something else is happening at the same time we've done these changes, helping students with meta majors find the right major, getting them registered for the right classes, giving them the microgrants to make sure they stay enrolled, and so forth. And that's this, that we've seen a huge drop in average time to degree at Georgia State. Very consistently so. We've cut basically a full semester over the last decade off the time it takes a student to complete a bachelor's degree. That's nice and feel good, but it's even better when you understand how it translates practically for the students. So this is the average debt load, total debt load, not annual debt load, of a Georgia State bachelor student at graduation. We've lowered the average debt load every year for the last 7 years. We've taken it from the 20s down to now in the 16s. And, when people ask, okay, well, how are you graduating your Pell students at the same rate as non-Pell students? Their first assumption is we must be raising lots of scholarship dollars. And we have huge levels of unmet need across our student body. I wish I could say we were effectively raising lots more scholarship dollars. We are not. That has not been the way that we've closed equity issues for our low-income students. You're looking at the way we've closed these equity issues for our low-income students. Get them into the right major efficiently, make sure they're registered for the right course, maximize the chances of them completing every right course that they're registered for, and get them graduated on time. Because if you can do that, it won't serve all the students, but think of all the students who couldn't have graduated if their debt load was $21,000, but can if it's $16,000 plus. The rough difference between our entire senior class of bachelor students graduating with the debt load that we had in spring 2016 versus the most recent spring term is about $20 million for that one graduating class alone. So that does lead me to beginning to talk about some collective impacts, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work of the NISS. What happens when we begin to scale these kind of changes? And I've talked about 4 this morning, but as I say, there are probably 6, 7, 8 additional ones I could have talked about. Well, one thing that has happened, and this is not unimportant for most of the campuses represented in this room, it's changed the financial footing and security of the university, especially at a time when the state of Georgia is disinvesting in higher education. So this is a calculus you can do for your home campus. It is admittedly a kind of down and dirty number. It's not precise, but it's precise enough so that it has led a lot of conversations at Georgia State, including with our CFO. What we did is we looked at what is the impact of improving our progression rates by 1 percentage point. By progression here, I mean not just the first-time, full-time students, but the whole undergraduate student body. And we went to our CFO and said, okay, what is the average amount of resources, money that an undergraduate is paying over the course of a 12-month period? You're looking at the calculus right now. Every time we improve our progression numbers by 1 point, we're generating about $3.3 million in additional tuition and fee income on an annual basis. In the time I've been describing this morning, we have not improved our numbers by 1 point. We've improved them by 25 percentage points. So we're talking about $80 million or so of additional revenue coming in. By most estimates, and we've run a number of ROI studies with Boston Consulting Group, the full extent of all the programs I've described to you and those I haven't, including the retention grant program where we have about $2 million a year in retention grants we're doling out, is under $10 million a year. So the benefit is basically 8 to 1 kind of profit margin over what we're generating compared to the investment that we've made. Of course, the motivation for me and for most of my colleagues was not to make the CFO's life easier. That was a bonus. It was this. What is the impact on students? Despite the fact that over the last decade, Georgia State is enrolling twice as many minoritized students and twice as many Pell students as we were 10 years ago. We're graduating every year 3,500 more students. That's an 84% increase. But look where the biggest gains have come from. We're up 84% overall, but 120% for black students, 180% for low-income students, 230+% for our Hispanic Latinx students. Not because any one of these programs is targeted by race or ethnicity or income level. You haven't heard me once mention this morning, oh, yeah, and this is a program for our first-gen students and for our Pell students and so forth. All of these things are programs that are available to all students. But what I can tell you with confidence is if you scale supports, intentional, well-implemented supports across your whole student body, the students who benefit the most will be the students who are struggling the most under the current bureaucracy. They're the ones who are disproportionately being tripped up. We saw that in the very first data slide I shared with you about that summer melt. When you have bureaucratic obstacles, they will create equity gaps. If you resolve those bureaucratic obstacles, that will disproportionately help students from underserved backgrounds. And because the gains have been across the board but disproportionately strong for our students from underserved backgrounds, our graduation rates have improved, not incrementally but exponentially. For some demographic groups, they have doubled and they're coming close to tripling. And as you heard in the introduction, perhaps most distinctively, we've had 7 years in a row where our black, our Hispanic, and our Pell students have graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. We know that's the way it should be, right? That's the way education should work. But the fact that Georgia State has been an outlier, thankfully we're not alone in that regard any longer, but has been an outlier, tells us how much work there is still for all of us to do. And this institution in the shadow of the Martin Luther King District that was segregated into the 1960s, now, and it's been for 6 years in a row, confers more bachelor's degree to African American students than any other college or university in the United States. And isn't that a more fitting testimony to the work of the Reverend King and the native son whose geography we share in downtown Atlanta? So let me say a little bit about how this work transfers to other contexts. Prior to the pandemic, we were visited by lots of campuses that wanted to come and spend a day or two to learn about what we were doing. In fact, it reached the point where there were over 500 schools in the years prior to the pandemic that had visited us, at least for a day. The U.S. State Department began to take educational visitors who were coming to the country to a stop in Atlanta to come to Georgia State as one of their stops. It was frustrating in a number of ways. One is we didn't have the bandwidth to serve these institutions, right? Most of us were doing hosting ad hoc based on the backs of full-time jobs that we were also trying to maintain. But it was frustrating for the campuses as well because they'd spend a day or so with us and leave with all kinds of questions and requests, and we didn't have the ability to respond. So during the pandemic, we created a proposal for an institute, a nonprofit institute that would be designed to create the resources campuses need to learn about these programs and to implement them. And so the NIST, the National Institute for Student Success, was founded a little under 3 years ago. We began working with institutions. Our model is we work with them for a minimum of 6 months. The first 6 months is the diagnostic. What we're doing is the same kind of analysis of the campus's administrative platforms that we performed on Georgia State to figure out, okay, what's happening? Do you have a problem with summer help? If so, what's happening with these students? Where are the obstacles? Do you have students dropping out close to graduating because they're running out of funding? What are the issues your particular students are facing? And then we offer, as part of that 6-month process, a set of recommendations. By contract, a campus that wants to work with the NIST has to agree that the president and the cabinet will sit for a 90-minute presentation of findings, because we found from experience that unless you get all the leaders, not just the president and provost, but the CFO and the head of HR and these other people, to understand why this work is important, why it will benefit not only the students but the bottom line of the institution, it's hard to get systematic change to occur. So we launched with modest expectations, thinking at this point we'd have a staff of about 16 people and maybe have worked with a couple dozen campuses. We have 100 partner institutions. As I mentioned, have a staff now of over 40 FTE who work full-time in this work. We work with entire state systems. We're working across 24 states. And a lot of our work is dedicated to helping the people in this room, the practitioners who do student success work on a day-to-day basis, be empowered both from the top of the institution so that they understand what kind of supports and buy-in you need from them, and also from a practical perspective to have the know-how and the skills in order to implement some of these changes, which many of us who advanced in the field of student success didn't necessarily get trained on initially. So what I can say about the results for this group is very promising. As I mentioned, we were only founded a little under 3 years ago. So there's a group of institutions we began working with initially who now have been working with us for 2.5, 3 years, and we've had 2 iPad cycles to see what kind of impact they're experiencing. This was one of the first cohorts. This is a group of 7 public institutions in Georgia that we launched, including, by the way, 3 public HBCUs in Georgia. For those of you who don't know, those are the first 3 schools listed on the screen. Those are the 3 public HBCUs in the state of Georgia. So what kind of results have we seen in 2 years? Pretty phenomenal. And this is not a patting on the back for the NIST. It's a kind of a charge for all of you to recognize that these changes, if they're made systematically, can begin to have profound impacts in a relatively short period of time. Because if you're used to doing something for a small cohort, then of course the impacts are going to be just for that cohort. But if you begin to scale changes that touch every student, then you begin to see significant changes. So across this group of 7 institutions that began working with us about 3 years ago in Georgia, we've seen over 2 iPad cycles an improvement in retention rates of almost 9 percentage points. To put that in perspective, the National Student Clearinghouse reports that over the last 2 years, the improvement nationally in retention rates has been about 1.5 points. So we're talking about 5 to 6 times that rate. And what we saw across those institutions is the same thing I've talked to you about all this morning. When you make these systematic changes and resolve administrative obstacles, they will disproportionately benefit students from underserved backgrounds. So if you look at the white students across these institutions, their retention rates over the last 2 years have improved by 5 points, well above the national average, so that's really good and positive news. But look there, for the black and Hispanic students across these same institutions, the improvements were almost 11 and 13 points respectively. Again, not because any of the interventions these schools are implementing are targeting particular demographic groups, they're the same systematic changes we've been talking about all morning long. So the last thing I'm going to do, and then we'll hopefully have time for a couple of questions for the group, and then, as I said, I'll be back here at 10:15 to just have an hour more casual discussion with anybody who wants to talk about these matters further. It's just underline why this work matters. I love the data, and I do think it's been absolutely instrumental for moving the needle at scale, not only at Georgia State, but at our partner institutions. But I do want to pause and underline the personal side of the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. One of the high points in Georgia State's transformation in student success occurred when we had a visit from someone you will probably recognize on the far right of that screen. When Bill Gates came to see us a few years ago, what was interesting and distinctive is that we did not invite him. He was coming to Atlanta to do a keynote on world health at the big convention center downtown. And a couple weeks before, his people call us up and say, oh, by the way, Bill's been reading about what you'll be doing with data and technology to help low-income students. Would you mind if he stopped by for a little bit to learn more about what you were doing? Yeah, just this once. We'll allow it just this once. And he came, didn't just drop by. He spent almost 3 hours with us. He sat and learned about the use of predictive analytics. He played with the chatbot and so forth. That was important for Georgia State because we have such a bad moral history. To be recognized for doing something positive, certainly by a national leader, was a kind of turning point for us and good for morale. But the high point of the visit was clearly when he met with our students. So he asked, or his team asked, that we pull together some of our first-gen students and just give Bill the chance to sit with them for 45 minutes and just talk, because they felt that Bill would enjoy it, but also benefit from hearing some of what they're going through. And the story of the students he met with underlines my message to you this morning about why this work should be systematic, why it shouldn't be targeted by certain demographic groups. Because to stare at that picture of these first-gen students meeting with Bill Gates for 45 minutes, there were some nerves in the room, I'll tell you. You might not guess who probably had the least likelihood of being sitting there that morning. But it was almost surely Austin. Austin came from a low-income family in North Georgia. His father was career military, and then when his father decommissioned from the Army, he ran a fruit and vegetable stand. So just by demographics across the state of Georgia, Austin already has less than a 10% chance of completing a college degree, just giving those demographic details. But the road in front of Austin was much rockier than for most, even in his economic situation. Because when he was in middle school, his father was diagnosed with ALS. And so it began a period of a number of years where Austin was required, as the oldest sibling, to come home immediately after school. His mother had a retail job. She would watch the husband and care for the husband during the day. And Austin would come home after hours from school, no extracurriculars for him, and help watch the dad and his siblings and so forth. So that's a lot to put on a middle school age student. He tells the story, which is quite sobering. He's very proud to this day of the fact that he regards himself to be one of the carefulest and smoothest drivers that he knows. Because as his father's health was declining, one of the last things his father wanted to do is teach him how to drive. And Austin was so concerned about his father's condition and causing his father's pain, he would, brake incredibly carefully and slowly and so forth. So, just putting these kind of burdens on somebody in that age group is just, unthinkable for many of us. And sadly, his father did pass away when Austin was in high school. And so, the chances that he's going to make his way to college are small. But despite all that, Austin was a great student. He not only completed his high school degree, he earned a state scholarship. And he applied to and got into Georgia State. He was excited about coming to Georgia State until he got his first bill in the beginning of August. And he opened up the email that had the electronic bill, and he was crestfallen because it was about $3,000 or $4,000 more than he was anticipating. And like a lot of first-generation students, the first reaction is to blame himself. He says he was embarrassed to even tell his mother because he said, "What an idiot. I thought I had figured out the finances, and I obviously hadn't, because this is much more expensive. I know my mom, working the retail job and so forth, can't afford the added $3,000 or $4,000 a year and so forth." But the good news here is that the year that Austin was struggling with his bill was the summer of 2016, the summer we launched our new chatbot. And though Austin was embarrassed to tell his mom, and didn't reach out physically to anybody on campus to figure out what was going on with his bill. He took to the chatbot and began to try to figure out why the bill was $3,400 more than he had anticipated. And what he found out is that there had been some mistake, maybe by him or somebody else, with his Social Security number on some state record, and the scholarship that he had earned had not been applied to his particular account. And as he tells the story, even though 99.9% of our students now pay for their university bills online, he and his mother, once they figured out, okay, yes, we do have the resources, they still owed a small balance, physically came downtown Atlanta to campus, stood in line at the cashier's office. He says, as he tells the story, tears were in his mother's eyes, so happy and proud that her son was going to college. And we're living at very divisive times. And today, of all days, kind of is appropriate to mention that. One important thing to observe about this universal approach to student success, systematic changes rather than demographically driven changes, is just the roster of state systems that NIST is currently working with. We are working with New York and some schools in California and so forth. We're also contracted with the Kansas Board of Regents, the University System of Georgia, systems in Maine and Michigan and so forth, in part because these are ways to achieve equitable outcomes without running afoul of the incredibly complex and sometimes insane politics that we have to face in many of our states. And the reality is, and I've seen it in discussions with Kansas Board of Regents and University System of Georgia, Texas Higher Ed Commission, we're also working with, by the way, and so forth, is that while we may be divided on so many issues, we're not divided on this one. That, when the students gathered at the end of Bill Gates' visit to take the inevitable selfie and so forth, we all can recognize that the world would be a much less welcoming, much valuable place if Austin, hadn't been in that picture. And the reality is, we know day to day how fragile the pathways that many of our students are taking. And it can be something that you do tomorrow, you do next week, you do next semester, that helps Austin and all the other students make it to that final moment of walking across the stage. So I do appreciate you being here today, especially because it's such a complicated and important day nationally. But more than that, I appreciate and thank you for what you do on behalf of students on a day-to-day basis. There are few things that you can be doing that's more important, that's more meaningful, and that has greater impact. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for the work you do.
And we have a small gift for you for participating today and giving us that amazing, amazing speech. So thank you so much. And I'd love to encourage you to stick around for the 10:15 talk, but we have a number of breakout sessions as well. So have a great day. Check in with us if you need anything. Thank you so much.